So they're talking about World War III. Are we in World War III? Did Ukraine start World War III? Did it set them ideas in motion towards World War III? Now keep in mind this was recorded at the end of 2014. Um, so it's in that context. I'm just going to take a step back and ask, what is World War III? Would we know it if we saw it? Would we know it if it had already started? Um, how do we define this thing? Um, I actually would hold to the perspective that see, it's very difficult to separate World War II from the Cold War. Um, I think that it's reasonable to extend the wars in Indochina that we refer to as the Vietnam War as an extension of the Second World War. I think it's reasonable to extend the conflicts in Eastern Europe as a consequence of the Second World War. And then when you look at all the proxy wars that happened in Africa and in different parts of Asia, it seems that what really happened was that the United States took over the role of the Axis power um, as the opponent to Russia, and the Second World War sort of carried on. So we can maybe think of the Cold War as the second phase of the Second World War, which itself is an extension of the First World War. And we really want to talk about this idea of the Great War, rather than a first and a second and a third and maybe even a fourth World War. Kind of understanding it in the context, the bigger context, including the Cold War. There's an open question as to whether we should be talking about the Fourth World War right now, rather than the Third. But then you have to recognize that it's hard to pull things apart. Where does the Cold War end? Does it end with the fall of the Berlin Wall, with the coup in Moscow? Because if it did, then like within a few years, you had NATO expansion into Eastern Europe. You had Clinton bombing Serbia. It's hard to really draw these lines in the sand. It seems that if you're going to look at the set of conflicts that's happening right now, and draw a conclusion as to when it started, well, it started in Yugoslavia. And if that's the case, well, then when did the Cold War end? It seems like it's all just a part of the same broad proxy conflict. That said, I think it is clear that something did change. And it changed in around the year 2011. And the catalyst, the thing that pushed that change was the removal of Gaddafi in Libya. The Russians have been very clear about pointing to that point as the end of the reset or the detente that Obama was tentatively pushing, and the reconstruction of an old set of conflicts, a new set of conflicts, whatever you want to look at it. It seems to be that is the point where something changed, and the reason was because, and this is actually quite topical. We're in the midst of an election that it looks like Hillary Clinton may very well win, and her role in this is dramatic because it was the whole what the Russians did was they looked at what the Americans did with Gaddafi. They claimed there was a human rights abuse, and they used it as an excuse to, to bomb targets, and then that was turned into a NATO invasion mission. It's not about the arguments that they used or how flimsy they were, or whether they were accurate or anything like that. What the Russians did was they looked at the situation and they said, if there was any pretension that the United Nations is a body where world bodies work together, um, and the world powers are um, treated as equals, then what the Americans did in Libya in 2011 abolished any remaining semblance of that world order that existed. Um, and to them, what they said was, there's not even any point of pretending. Um, you can't trust a thing the Americans say. They will attempt to manipulate events as they wish. They're not. What happened with Gaddafi and Libya is that the Russians decided that the Americans were not an honest partner. Okay, and it took a long time and a lot of false promises. There was the we're not moving east on NATO thing, and everything else. But there was Iraq. There was a long list of things, and the Russians kind of got. I'm sorry, I had to actually check uh, the point where that went out. I got a problem with this, don't I? If I ever buy another one of these cameras, I'm gonna make sure that I can just plug it in. That would be so much nicer. Um, this was only $50. It's, as you can see, the quality is not very good, but I don't really care. It's really more about what I'm saying than it is about what you're looking at. So, um, it's all about the audio quality, really. And the audio quality is not very good either. But I don't really particularly care. It's just more about having a way to capture what I'm thinking. I'd really be just as well off with a tape recorder, to be honest with you. Anyways, I had to go back and check that because this is actually a bit of an important screed. So the Russians had gotten to the end of the list on things that they could kind of wait out, right? So they tried it with a Republican president. They tried it with a Democratic president. They tried it with different combinations with the Congress, and they concluded that there's no configuration. For the longest time, the Russians seem to have been under the sort of naive perception that eventually the Americans would have a peace movement. The people would take over the government, and these imperialist wars wouldn't happen. It was maybe a little bit of a holdover from the whole communist global kind of ideology that capitalism will collapse upon itself. Maybe a little bit of a holdover from that. Changed a little bit from capitalism will collapse upon itself to the American state will collapse upon itself. But it was the same basic idea, just kind of ported forward a little bit. And it was Gaddafi where that's kind of thinking seems to have ended. And it was a consequence of just the total brazen lack of respect. It's hard to know whether you should blame this directly on Clinton, or you should blame this on Clinton's staffers, or broadly on the department for allowing it to happen. But it's just at the level of a Fox News broadcast, and you're standing on the other side of it. You're a Russian state, you're a world power, you're smart people, and you're just being fed this line of nonsense and treated like idiots. And perhaps the irony of it is that the I mean, the people creating this and pushing it through were they dumb enough to think people would fall for it? I think that's the open question. But like I say, from the Russian perspective, they stopped wondering about it. It just got to the point where they said, "This is absurd," um, and we're not going to pretend as though we have a real partner on the other side of this anymore. We understand now that this is an empire that is out to harm us, to reduce us um, uh, to nothing, and will carry out whatever tactics as absurd and outrageous as they might be in order to get to that endpoint. And it was just the absolute trivialization of international law. It was the See, it's funny that the Clinton campaign is trying to use critical, theory to try to build up support among certain segments because it's actually the perfect example of critical theory. The administration using, ideas in terms of within international law, as a means to further an end. Now, I mean, it's not the first time this has ever happened, of course, right? She was learning from, her husband, the master of it. Clinton did it. Clinton put down the template, right? I mean, Bush followed the template that Clinton put down. And Obama is still carrying it through. But when Clinton did it, it was just so. Or again, I don't whether it was Clinton or Clinton staffers or just the State Department broadly. I mean, and you need to look at, is it somebody on Obama's side trying to make her look bad, or who knows, right? But the takeaway from it was just that like this isn't even pretending to care about human rights. This isn't even pretending to be using the UN as a legitimate tool to enforce human rights. It's the reduction of the entire legal system to a blatantly fraudulent tool of imperialist expansion, and so something clicked on the Russian side. Now I'm not just deducing that. This isn't something that I'm just constructing out of evidence. The Russians themselves have stated on numerous occasions. Many people, from the foreign minister Sergei Lavrov, Dmitry Medvedev, Putin himself, and I'm sure you can find many other examples where they cite the removal of Gaddafi as this pivot point, this turning point in the relations with the United States. So it's not entirely clear what World War III is, what it's going to look like. In the end, it may look like centralized bureaucracies, instituting revolts to carry out specific goals for the purposes of global finance, which is what it's been up to now. With the odd strategic bombing campaign, to remove somebody if they can't do that. But it's kind of like the last straw kind of thing. But that said, a lot of these attempts have failed. Look at ISIS, for example. So, how long do they keep this going for? It's unclear. I think it's clear that it will continue on for the length of Clinton's presidency. If she wins, I don't think she has any intent at all of reversing this. If anything, she wants to prove that she's sophisticated enough that she understands it. As the rest of the world bangs their head against how facile she's applying it. But I mean, that might be what World War III is in the end. And if that's the case, then perhaps it did begin with the removal of Gaddafi. Um, on the other hand, we may, um, you know, look back on this period and be unable to disentangle it from the Cold War itself, and it might just be seen as a bigger, broader string of incidents. I've pointed this out before as well too, that in the broader scheme of things, it's still the empires fighting over East and West. But if we try to localize it, if we try to hone in, if we try to find points of uh, that are important, where things changed, um, where conflicts morphed from one form to another, I think that the point that people are going to look at and pulled out as of the utmost importance, and again, the Russians themselves have pointed to it, is the removal of Gaddafi in 2011, and the primary culprit is going to be Hillary Clinton. They're talking about if a World War III scenario would occur, which countries would be fighting against each other, and specifically, is the Russia-China alliance a real thing? Well, if you want to know if the Russia-China alliance is a real thing, the first thing you should do is ask China. And China will tell you that they do not believe in military alliances. They do not believe in military alliances because they are a singular state, and they will not be tied by agreements that may force them to act against their own interests. So, the idea of a defense alliance with China is meaningless because they won't uphold what they sign. So he's talking about an agreement where China promised to interfere should the Russians invade the Ukraine. I would find that very hard to believe for the reasons I'm suggesting, that China doesn't sign those kinds of agreements. It believes that those kinds of agreements tie its hands, and it refuses to involve itself with them. So what is the SCO, for example? Then, well, it's a security agreement where they share information, but it's not an alliance. The Chinese actually do military exercises with the Americans as well. The only country that China is really actively concerned about real conflict with is Japan. And there's historical reasons for that. I won't get into it. But is there a Russia or a Sino-Russian alliance? No. In fact, I think that a big part of what World War III is about competition between China and the United States for hegemony over Russia. See, and this is a big difference, right? Because throughout the whole Cold War, throughout the entire 20th century, in fact, even going back quite a bit further, the Russians were a rival for hegemonic. They were a superpower. They were a world state, a world power, a major force in both of the world wars and wars before it. The idea that they might be reduced to the province of an empire is a new phase of history, is it not? But that is what's happening, right? I know I went through this once before. Russia has a history as the eastern part of the Roman Empire, and that is the history that most Westerners understand the context of Russia in. It also has a history as the far western extreme of the Mongolian Empire, meaning that it has a history within the sphere of Eastern civilization as well. And I mean this bristles up against all the racial theories that are popular on the left and everything else, that that have been pretty clear that I'm pretty critical of. Um, but it is the actual historical reality, is that Eastern civilization doesn't end somewhere, in Central Asia. The Mongols controlled Russia for centuries. There's a country in Europe called Hungary, which is an Eastern ethnic group. There are Turkish groups all over Eastern Europe, and a country called Turkey itself. The sphere of Eastern civilization across the steppes is much broader, and depending on how you define it, it may even be its source of origin. So the idea of China wanting to extend its sphere of influence considerably to the west, through the Central Asian republics, if you want to call them stands, anyways, through the stands, and over Russia itself, is very much realistic, right? So what the Chinese seem to be mostly concerned about right now, at this very moment, is exerting its hegemony over the Central Asian region. Okay, and that means working with the Russians. It also means working with the Americans, although more often than not competing with the Americans, to build bases, trade routes, all these sorts of things. The wild card that's inserted itself into that discussion after this video was done, again, it was done in 2014, is that the Indians also want an influence over that region, and they have their own historical reasons. In fact, while Russia itself may have a history within the Mongolian Empire, the smack dab middle of Central Asia is historically and ethnically closer aligned to Iran, but to India, than it is to Russia or to China. So if there was a major power that was to assert hegemony over all these stands, the best fit historically would be Iran. But if Iran is not going to be a great power, then the next closest fit historically would be India, not Russia or China, right? But India doesn't have the same kinds of reach, the same kind of aspirations, or even the same motivations or desire to have this kind of extended space, right? But that's a competition that's developing as well, right? So this idea that they're presenting, like BRICS versus NATO, is completely wrong. If anything, what's happening is that NATO is being pushed out and rendered almost irrelevant, except in the context of how it works itself into the competition over hegemony over Eastern Europe, right? So you can almost really reduce the Americans to the military suppliers for the Germans, right? And then you have like a three-way struggle, with the Germans backed by the Americans, and the Chinese as the major powers, trying to fight over splitting up the Russian state. Of course, the Russians have different ideas. The Russians would like to reassert themselves. They'd like to rebuild. They'd like to, reposition themselves. But the way that China works into that is really not as a force that's going to facilitate a Russian rise. The Chinese don't want that for obvious reasons, right? But more as a force that is trying to position itself in a way that it can take advantage of a Russian collapse through Western um, uh, Asia, and pushing into Eastern Europe, right? So, um, I mean, that's not to say that the Chinese have sided with the Americans so much as it is to point out that they will not sign an alliance with either side. They will change sides depending on what is in their best interests. And it's, I mean, they're in the process right now of waiting it out to see which side goes better. Of course, if the Russians do manage to build themselves up, then it might. I mean, on the one hand, the Chinese are going to want to do what they can to try to keep them down a little bit, but on the other hand, they're going to want to get on their good side. The flip side of that is that if they get pulled down too much, they're going to want to do what they can to prevent the Americans from taking over, while getting as much of it as they can themselves. It's really quite similar to the world as it was discussed in 1984. It's quite Orwellian. You've got your East Asia. Is Oceania at war with East Asia or Eurasia? Who knows? Shifts back and forth. And that is, if any kind of a hot conflict does develop out of it, that's what it's going to be like. With the Chinese bouncing back and forth. There is a more of a fundamental conflict between Russia and the United States. I think it goes back centuries. It's the conflict between the British and Russian empires. It's more of a, which, as I've stated, is the conflict between the Eastern and Western Roman empires. It's more of a fundamental conflict. And sees itself in more directly in terms of strict hegemony. Whereas the Chinese kind of see themselves in the middle, and ultimately, I think it's quite clear, would prefer to see Russia disintegrate for its own benefit than align with Russia against an overly aggressive America. But of course, it relies on America not being overly aggressive and a mutual defense not being necessary. So I mean, it's complicated. Everybody's playing each other off against each other. There is no Russia-China alliance. There's no alliance with India. Either India is just looking to maximize its own interests, except in the sense that once again, the Indians seem to be very skeptical of the Americans as well. The Indians seem mostly concerned about trying to prevent the Americans from starting a war between India and China. And they're very suspicious about American interests regarding divide and conquer tactics. And just, I think maybe to put it succinctly, India recognizes that America is the great Satan. They accept that perspective, and they're very skeptical of what America wants to do. So they're keeping an arm's length, but they're certainly, they don't have any specific interests in further integrating with Russia or China. If anything, they are maybe a little later to the game, but definitely very interested in competing over resources in that strategic area. And of course, you've got the Iranians as well, who have the greatest claim to the region, but are very much hemmed in and very much in danger of losing their sovereignty in any real sense to the Russians. So yeah, I mean, it's the idea of everybody against NATO is, if World War III develops, it's not going to be a fight to take down NATO. It's going to be a fight to split the remnants of the Russian Empire, and probably mostly amongst China, and an American-backed European Union.